All right. And we are back. So I would like to welcome in a friend of mine, actually co-worker of mine, Vienna Harvey. Vienna, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Marlon. Thanks for having me here. This is really exciting.
Awesome. So Vienna, we're gonna dive right in here. Where are you from?
I grew up traveling around a lot, so that's a bit of a difficult question for me to answer. But I moved to California from Virginia, and that's where my family is still based.
So is it a military or?
No, just my family likes to travel. So we actually
No.
lived on a sailboat for 4 years when I was a kid. So that
Okay, Paul, I
us
gotta hear this. I gotta hear
to
this.
us.
Tell me about that experience.
It was really cool. And my family just kind of on a whim decided that that would be a cool experience to do with their kids. So they packed up the whole family, moved us from Seattle onto a sailboat, and off we went.
Wait, so I think Ryan earlier from Seattle too. We got a couple people referencing Seattle and stuff today. And I
Yeah,
know
Seattle's a good place.
we got some people in the chat and stuff is in
Nice.
Seattle too as well. So what about high school? Did you go to high school in Seattle too as well?
No, I was homeschooled my whole life until college, but by the time I was high school age, that was once my family was in Virginia. So I did those years on the East Coast, and then
Okay.
came back to California for college.
So with college, you went to Stanford, correct?
I did, yes.
Talk about that transition as far as going from homeschool to Stanford. What did that look like?
It was definitely kind of overwhelming at first, especially going into a university like Stanford that can be a very high pressure environment and having to figure out how to make the adjustment of moving across the country from my family and going to school and having that school be Stanford kind of all at the same time. But overall, I did have a really good experience at Stanford once I kind of figured out the lay of the land a little. And so I did really enjoy those years.
How long did that take to figure out the pace? I would imagine this is probably like your first time living by yourself. Like how long did that process?
Yeah, definitely took a few
take?
months to get settled in, especially because Stanford's on the quarter system. So everything moves very, very fast there. It's like you've just gotten into the swing of one quarter and then it's over and the next one started and you have to get used to a whole new set of classes and professors. It can be a lot to take in.
For sure. So what did you study over at Stanford?
I spent my first 2 years kind of bouncing around, not really knowing what I wanted to do or what I wanted to major in. And eventually, through a series of twists and turns, I found myself at the program in Science, Technology, and Society, which is one of Stanford's interdisciplinary majors. So that's what I ended up majoring in. And I was drawn to that department because it's one of the most flexible majors at Stanford. So you can draw classes from a lot of different departments and a lot of different disciplines to create a program that really works for you and plays to your specific interests. And so I really appreciated that flexibility and that ability to kind of customize the plan to fit what I wanted to be doing.
So talking about Stanford, what are some of the ways, kind of like as you're kind of good in your career, what are some of the ways things Stanford did to help you either prepare or benefit you as you started your working career?
Stanford obviously has a very large and very spread out alumni network. And so that's something that's been really helpful. So my parents actually also went to Stanford. So I have access to not only my own alumni network, but also theirs. And so by having those opportunities to meet family friends who had also gone to Stanford and are now well established in their careers in the area, or knowing classmates of mine who had then gone out and started to establish themselves in the area, just having those connections and having those relationships throughout the Bay Area has been really helpful. But I think the biggest thing that Stanford has done for my career was actually get me to my current job at Udacity. And that came out of my senior year honors thesis that I wrote about self-driving cars. And so it was that thesis that a friend of my parents who went to Stanford, who worked at Udacity, had read. And she said, aha, I know someone you should meet. And she introduced me to David Silver at Udacity, who heads our School of Autonomous Systems. And so he and I got to talking, and that was eventually what led to me getting hired at Udacity. So that was definitely a pretty big impact that Stanford has had for me there.
So before you got to Udacity, what role did you, what were you able to get coming out of Stanford?
Straight out of college, I was at a startup in Redwood City. And so I was there for about a year and a half, kind of just ended up there because I needed a job that was in the area. I was still kind of trying to figure out more long-term what I wanted to do and where I wanted to be. But I did know that I wanted to stay in the Silicon Valley area and try and get my foot into the tech world a little bit. And so I was at a startup in Redwood City for a while, just to be in the area, get some roots down here and start figuring out what I wanted to do. And then I came to Udacity about 2 years ago.
So is it fair to say that this was definitely not only was it an adjustment period coming, being homeschool and stuff, and then coming over to the Bay Area, but also not even coming to the Bay Area, but working in tech. Is it fair to say that this was a little bit of career and culture shock for you?
Definitely, yeah. And I think especially so because I had this idea that I wanted to be working in the tech sphere somehow. I knew I had that interest, but I've never considered myself an engineer. And so I didn't necessarily want to go the computer science software engineering route. And of course, that's what Stanford is known for. So being at Stanford and then just being in the Bay Area in general, but not being part of that computer science software engineering group has definitely been tricky to navigate. And I think it definitely was a bit of a culture shock, just figuring out how to adjust to that and trying to figure out where is there a place for me in all this without going that path.
So you're at the startup, you're coming from, being homeschooled, you're finding your way to Stanford, which is a significant jump. It's probably, Stanford is considered one of the most pristine, universities. And then not only did you find yourself at Udacity, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest e-learning platforms there is, but you go into something like autonomous systems, which is very much in a trial era of trying to figure things out. Two things: why Udacity, and then why autonomous systems?
Yeah, so I'll start off with why Udacity. So as you mentioned, I did grow up homeschooled, so that already put me on sort of a non-traditional education path. And as part of that, I did do a lot of online classes. And that was something that I really appreciated for the flexibility that it gave me to, similar to what I did at Stanford, kind of draw from a lot of different areas and put together a customizable plan that worked for me. So I've always had that kind of interest in online education and that thought that the flexibility that online education offers is something that's really valuable, especially in today's world where things are changing really quickly. It's pretty common for people to start off in one career and then try to switch to something else. And so that was something that drew me to Udacity as an area that I'd already had some experience with as a student, and feeling that I could then, pay it forward and be in a role that would let me give some of those opportunities to other people as well. And then why autonomous systems? So I briefly mentioned that my senior year at Stanford, I was writing this honors thesis about self-driving cars. And Marlon, as you said, this is still a pretty new area. It's very much in a trial phase. There's a lot of gray areas. And that was actually what got me interested in it, was the fact that it's so new, so many gray areas. There's so many things that are still being figured out for this technology that could have a huge impact on people in the world we live in. And so for my thesis, I was doing research not so much about the technical side of how you make the car, how the car works, but focusing more on the social and ethical implications of these cars. And I thought it was really interesting to get into that side of things a little bit and start to look into how are people thinking about these gray areas? Is this something that self-driving car companies are really thinking about? And so having that interest in self-driving cars, I was then really excited to find out that Udacity has a self-driving car program. And not only that, we have an actual self-driving car for the program. And so I was excited to have the opportunity to combine this interest in self-driving cars and this interest in education and bring those together into one place.
So you said something very interesting here. That you said you got pretty good at kind of creating your own learning path. Talk about that, because we got a lot of people who's tuning in now who are either day ones, fresh out of boot camp, or even some senior engineers where we all got to continuously to learn. Talk about some things that you learned to probably how to create the best learning plan for yourself.
I would say it's really important to have short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals and figure out your plan in sort of chunks like that. And you can do that in either direction. You can start with short-term and work up to long-term, or start with longer-term and then work backwards to the short-term. But figuring out, what do I want to be doing a month from now, or 6 months from now, or 5 years from now, and then making plans that can work within that. And so short-term one could be finding a super short little free course, or a book that you want to read, or something that's a nice little bite-sized first place to start. And then you could work your way up to a longer online course or a boot camp once you've kind of given yourself that first taste to see, is this something that you do want to be doing? So I would say definitely thinking about the long term, but also not letting yourself get so overwhelmed with that long-term plan, and kind of reining it back in and starting off with smaller, more manageable steps.
I think one of the overwhelming things that you just mentioned is, somebody told me a while ago to make sure as you're learning that you don't become a professional student.
Yeah.
And so how can an individual avoid that? Because you're just like learning course after course after course after course, so you're just like going from book to book to book, but you're not actually kind of like putting it to use. So how can somebody kind of avoid that professional student path?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good thing to be aware of, and something that can be really challenging to avoid, because there's always more out there to learn. And it's really easy to fall into that trap of feeling like, I haven't learned enough if I just do this one more thing. But then there's always one more thing after that. So I would say make sure that in addition to learning, you're also doing, and you're getting practice actually applying the skills that you learn in some sort of real world context. So if you're trying to learn programming, for example, find some programming project that you can do on the side that will let you start building up a portfolio. So you could try finding a nonprofit maybe and doing some pro bono work for them, or finding a friend who's building a website or something like that. But finding those projects that you can start to do outside of an academic context to start building up a portfolio of projects that you can then show to employers to demonstrate that you have some experience, not just as a student.
So you mentioned project, and one of your projects that you have the freedom to work on, in a sense, because I'm saying it because I'm kind of jealous. One of your projects name is Carla.
Yes.
So talk about number one. We'll talk about first, what you do in your day to day, and then who is Carla, and what is her billing, what she does.
So Carla is a coworker of mine at Udacity. We work very closely together. We do a lot together. Carla is the name of our self-driving car. And what we use that car for is final projects for our self-driving car engineer nano degree program. So students in that program are writing code that then actually drives a real car through the real world. That's something that we were really excited about when we first launched that program, and it's something that has continued to perform really well for us and that students seem to really enjoy. So what that looks like is that students work in teams to submit this capstone project. So we encourage teams of usually 4 to 5 students because it is a lot of work, and we want them to get that experience of working together and also make sure that nobody is getting overwhelmed by the amount that they have to do. And then they submit their projects to us, and everything is tested first in simulation. So we have a simulator built in Unity that includes a virtual testing track where we run a virtual car with the student's code. That involves having the car smoothly start from a stop. It has to detect a traffic light and identify what color the traffic light is so that it can stop if the light is red and then start driving again when the light turns green. And again, having that smooth acceleration from a stop. And then it has to be able to follow the path that has been set for it and not swing outside of the path. So if the submission passes on the simulator test, that's when I take them out to the actual car. And so we have a testing lot in Palo Alto that we use that's a similar setup to the virtual test track. We have a set path that the car needs to drive, and we have a traffic light that the car needs to identify. And so running the student's code, they should be able to have the car start driving, identify the red light, stop for the light, wait for it to turn green, start driving again, and then continue driving around the rest of the path. And at that point, I'm able to give the students feedback on how their submission has done and send that back to them along with the data files that the car test and the simulator tests have generated so they can see all of that.
So with starting the project for the capstone, talk about what language they're using, how the car itself is recognizing the red lights and stuff around it and everything around it. And then thirdly, let's say something goes terribly wrong, maybe not so in the simulator, but in the car, what does that feedback look like to the student?
Sure. So Carla has a 4-layer software stack. We're running Ubuntu as the base layer. Then on top of that is ROS, the robot operating system. And that's a message passing layer that enables the code and the car to communicate, essentially. Then on top of that is AutoWare, which is an open source software for self-driving cars that basically just provides a nicer interface to use to interact with the lower layers. And then we have some in-house code that we've written on top of that for some other features that we need. We also have a big red emergency stop button right in the center console of the car. So if anything goes horribly wrong and I can't take back control by grabbing the wheel or pressing the brakes pedal, if those fail, the emergency stop button is right there. I've never had to use that button during a student code test. Hopefully I never will have to, but it's there just in case. And then
Okay.
Marlon, I think there was one other part of that question. What was the other thing?
Okay, so well, you already said that nothing has usually, you haven't been able to press that button yet. So talk about the simulation. So let's say in a simulation, something does go horribly wrong. What does that communication look like back to the student?
Sure. So the simulator returns a message with the status of that test at the end of it, which I'm able to look at. And if it says passed, then I can say, okay, this did everything it needs to, off to the real car. It could also say something like the car didn't stop for the light, but it was otherwise okay. And that's also probably one that I would still put on the real car because that suggests that it's still able to drive and follow the path. It just didn't quite get the traffic light. So that's not a dangerous submission to run on the real car. But if it gets one where the car drives way off the path or drives at a higher speed limit than the maximum we've set for it, those are ones that I'll usually send straight back to the student with just simulator results and not put those on the real car because those are the ones that could be dangerous in the real world.
So for students, how much experience are you usually seeing from somebody who who's maybe been coding for a while or even been just like started, what are students usually their background if they want to switch over to autonomous, working on autonomous systems?
For self-driving car, we do get a lot of students coming into that who are already established software engineers, but they're looking to transition into autonomous systems or autonomous vehicles as a specialty. And so they already have a very strong programming or math background. They just want this particular area of focus. We do also get some students who are looking to transition into a career in autonomous systems engineering from something completely different. And those are the students that we tend to see coming through a full progression of our nano degrees. So beginning with maybe intro to programming, and then intro to self-driving cars, and then self-driving car engineer, and then maybe they go on to robotic sensor fusion or whatever else to really build up a more complete path with us.
So we live in a world now where we're starting to see more and more self-driving cars, so I think it's fair to say in the US, no matter where you live, you've probably seen a Tesla, we have self-driving car capability. From your perspective, let's kind of take a step back. From what you see right now, are self-driving cars safe? Are they safe to not only work on, from a software side, and then, or secondly, are they safe to drive and get behind the wheel of?
Sure. So I live in Palo Alto, which is kind of self-driving car central. I have a 10-minute drive to the office. I might see 5 or 6 self-driving cars just in that 10-minute drive. So I've gotten very used to seeing them around. And I will say I've never felt unsafe driving or biking or walking on the road next to one of those self-driving cars. They all seem very in control and seem to be behaving very rationally and in a way that matches up with the behavior of drivers around them. I've also had the chance to ride in one of Waymo's self-driving cars and get sort of the internal experience of that as well. And again, I did feel very safe with that. Everything felt very controlled and very well handled. And there was a safety driver in the car at that time who was there ready to take over in case anything went wrong. Now, being in Udacity's car is a little different because that's not a road-ready self-driving car. That's not something that we're taking out and having it drive itself around real streets. It is a much lower level, much more constrained scope of operation there. And so while I've never felt unsafe or like, oh no, I'm about to die, there have definitely been some times where the car would do something that I wasn't expecting it to do, and I would have to grab the wheel to take back control, or where the code was just a little not quite right enough to make me a little nervous, but not quite enough to hit the emergency stop button. And so it is a very different experience being in a Waymo car versus being in Carla, and seeing those as kind of two ends of the spectrum of what self-driving cars can be. But I think the ones that are out on the roads now are doing a good job from what I've seen and from what I've experienced.
You mentioned earlier that there's some ethics issues and stuff in the field. Elaborate on that. What are you talking about?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that comes up with ethics and self-driving cars is this idea that to some extent the car has to be programmed in advance, and that involves some sort of foresight and consideration of what type of scenarios might this car encounter in the future and how should it respond at that point. And that can get a little ethically dicey if you're getting into a scenario where maybe there's going to be a car crash and somebody's going to get hurt. How should the car respond in that type of scenario? So if you're familiar with the trolley problem, the classical ethical thought experiment where there's a trolley on a track and it's going to hit 5 people on the track, but you have a lever that could switch it onto a different track and only hit 1 person. And obviously that's a very simplistic, very black and white scenario that hopefully we're not likely to see that actually come to light. But that type of situation where you have to think about how the car should be acting before it gets into that scenario, I think can be a little tricky, because the car doesn't have the ability as much as a human driver does to make an impulsive or instinctive decision in the moment.
So I guess one of the things that you may hear in blogs and in media, and one of the things that say self-driving cars, the ethic is recognizing a particular individual. So they may be a particular individual of a particular gender, or maybe another particular skin color. What are some of the gaps right now that you see in the industry? What that may cause future problems, if any?
So I do remember seeing something a while back that was talking about that issue of camera's ability to recognize different skin colors and different colors in general. And that's why, for example, people are advised to not wear dark clothing if they're out walking at night. It's that same type of problem where it's less contrast between the tones makes it harder to detect. And that's something that I think other sensors like LiDAR can help compensate for, because LiDAR, which uses lasers, is not dependent on color and contrast in the same way that a camera is. So it can detect an object that's there even if the object is a dark colored tree, for example, or a black car at night. The LiDAR will be able to pick that up, whereas a camera might struggle. And similarly, a camera may be more affected by adverse weather conditions than a LiDAR would be. So if it's raining and the camera's visibility is maybe not as great, a LiDAR or a radar might still be able to function better than a camera in those circumstances. So I think it's really important to keep in mind multiple different sensor types and how they can help balance each other out.
So talk about with self-driving cars and stuff, some experiences that you see that may go through heavy like weather conditions. And so, it may be raining really hard, snowing very hard, it's very windy. From your experience, how does the car respond to those type of conditions?
Well, here in Palo Alto, we don't really get weather all that much. So I've never been in a self-driving car in more than a light rain, at which point it's all still fine. But I know that there are self-driving car companies that are starting to test in areas where maybe they do get more rain or they do get heavy wind. And so I think that's just a matter of continually testing and retesting and trying to just accumulate as many test miles and as much data as possible to try and give the cars the best chance they can have, basically, and make sure that they have a lot of data on which to base their decisions.
So when you say kind of getting a lot of data and stuff, from that, is it fair to say that can be done through simulation, or does it have to be real life data for the car to perform its best?
I think there is definitely a place for simulation data, and that's important as well, and is a really good way to start working on things before they make it out to the real world, and to practice in a more controlled environment, more controlled even than a confined testing lot. But ultimately, I do think there's no replacement for real world miles and real world data.
So from your vantage point, from your perspective, we'll go 5 years. Where do you see the world of autonomous systems, and self-driving cars? I mean, you have anything from, the vacuum cleaners, you got bikes and stuff coming out, from a 5-year point, where do you see this world transitioning to?
I think one of the first areas that we're going to start really seeing a lot of self-driving cars in a way that your average person who's not working on those is going to interact with them is going to be in the areas of delivery. And so there's a startup here in California called Neuro that just recently got the first ever permit to test driverless zero occupancy vehicles without a person in them. So these are little delivery vehicles that are designed to be delivery bots. So they don't have a driver, they don't have a steering wheel, they don't have any of the features that a regular car needs to have to accommodate a human. And I think that's going to be the first area that we're really going to see this take off, because you don't need to consider as much the human experience of being in that car. You don't need to worry about where will the seat belts go? How will the person feel about being in here? And then from there, as people get more accustomed to that, that's when I think we'll start to see it really take off with passenger vehicles as well.
For sure. So I remember I saw a video, not sure how long ago. I know Domino's was trying, and I'm not sure if the car was fully, it was fully self-driving. But I know Domino's was trying to do that. And so, what other areas is, so you said food delivery, which I definitely see the benefit. You definitely don't have to worry about your driver maybe trying to get some of the fries, or what it may be, but also see that how this is kind of like possibly taking away maybe somebody's day-to-day job. And so what other areas do you see things like autonomous vehicles, autonomous systems and stuff kind of taking over?
I think public transportation is another big one, because things like trains and buses, those tend to have very defined, very limited routes, and they just have to know that one route and do that one route over and over. And so I think that's another area where it will be easier to start to integrate self-driving technology, where it won't be as complicated or as disruptive as just setting the cars loose on the roads to go wherever.
Gotcha. Okay. So for engineers and stuff here, who want to, this is something that's number one, is going to be life changing for a lot of people. This is a field that I definitely kind of been keeping my eye on for sure. Even at the start of the iRobot vacuum cleaner. So for people here who are listening in and see this as an opportunity where they can kind of get their hands in and possibly change the world, because it's going to happen, frankly, with or without us. So what are the next steps that somebody can take if they want to look to get into this area of autonomous vehicles? What are the next steps that an individual is going to take? And we're going to give you three personalities. We're going to say that the day one person, who hasn't started engineering yet, the person who's maybe just kind of finished, the boot camp, college, self-learning, and then the person who's already in the field of engineering. And so what are the next steps those three individuals can take?
Okay. So for the day one person who's never done anything like this before, but they want to get into the field, the most important thing is going to be really beefing up your programming and math skills, because those are the foundation that everything else in this field is built on. So learn to program, make sure algebra, calculus, linear algebra comes into a lot as well. So have a couple programming languages under your belt, ideally, and then start working on specialization into the field of autonomous systems later on, once you get those basics really solid. For someone who's maybe just come out of a boot camp or has done a little bit of education or more academic things in this area, then I would say maybe start bringing it into the specialty a little more. So look at something like Udacity's self-driving car nanodegree program, or our robotics nanodegree program, or other education resources for things like robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Those are all really central to the broader field of autonomous systems. And I would also recommend finding people you can reach out to who are already in this industry and ask if you can talk to them a bit about what their work looks like and how they got into it, and start to get a sense of where within the field of autonomous systems you might like to go, because there are so many specializations within it. And so then carrying on that thread, for someone who is already an engineer and maybe has been in industry for a while, but is now looking to get this really specific focus, again, I would say figure out what type of focus you want to have. Do you want to be working on perception? Do you want to be working on localization? Do you want to be working on control or mapping or any actually building the sensors, more hardware, more software? So figuring out not just, oh, I want to work on self-driving cars, but getting a better sense of what that actually looks like for you. And again, talking to people who are working in areas that you think you might be interested in is really helpful to get a sense of what that job actually looks like in the real world.
Okay. Sweet. All right. Well, here we're going to dive into a Q&A here. We got a few minutes, and we got a couple questions here. Questions from Faisal. He says, how did you learn all the tech involved in autonomous driving? Did you write the software yourself for Carla? And how did you learn how to read students' code and debug logs?
Okay, so I took a few computer science classes when I was at Stanford, so that's where I got sort of my programming base. But as far as the autonomous vehicle specific stuff, almost all of that I learned on the job at Udacity just by being in and around Carla and figuring it out as I went and asking for help from the people who were here before me. So I have written some code for Carla, not any of the code that we use in our current capstone testing. That was all in place before I even came to Udacity. But I have worked on some code for Carla for some of our newer, more experimental stuff that isn't part of the nano degree program. And as I said, I learned to code and read students' code and do the debugging just from being in the car and doing it and watching other people do it and seeing what they were doing. And a lot of Googling error messages to see what they mean and seeing what other people have said about them.
Awesome. So the next question is from Steven. He says, what maintenance opportunities exist with self-driving technology, 5G networks, electric charging station, drones, etc.?
That's a really interesting question. I think you touched on some good ones there. I'm not very familiar with anything 5G related, but I'm sure we will start to see that become a lot more prevalent. Electric charging stations, I think there were huge opportunities to combine autonomous vehicle technology and electric vehicle technology. And I do think that's really going to be the way that things trend towards in the future. So there's definitely opportunities there, both just in figuring out how to combine these. And then, as you said, charging stations are going to be really important, and just general maintenance and upkeep of the vehicles themselves. And that general maintenance and upkeep of the vehicles, that's going to include some hardware maintenance, as you would expect from any vehicle. It's going to need its tires taken care of. It might need to fix a cracked windshield or something. But there's also going to be a lot of software maintenance involved in making sure that the operating systems and the code and all that is running up to standard, and that they're not accumulating so much technical debt that it's going to be a huge problem to try and fix later.
Awesome. Okay. Next question is from Brianna. She said, what is one of your personal long-term goals for self-driving cars?
So I hate driving, so I would really like to own a self-driving car so that I don't have to drive anymore. But in terms of more generally where the industry and the field is going, I'd really like to see them spread further beyond Silicon Valley and a very tech-savvy audience and start to reach people who maybe aren't so prone to being excited about them. Because a lot of the people who are in this area or in this industry, of course, they're going to be really excited about this. But someone's grandma in Nebraska, this might be really weird and scary to her. And I think that's something that the industry is going to have to really grapple with, is how do we make this new scary technology more appealing to a wide range of people, because that's how we're really going to get that broad adoption.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question from that. From what you see with self-driving cars, what are some of the benefits? You know, this can get to a wide range of acceptance. What are some of the benefits you will see if people start to adopt self-driving cars more?
A big one, I think, is just improving accessibility of transportation and making easy transportation available to people who may not necessarily have that right now. So that could be someone with a vision impairment who's not able to drive a car, or it could be someone who has a severe anxiety about driving a car and isn't able to do that now. Or it could be someone who's either too young or too old to be driving a car by themselves. I think it's also something that could be really useful in the healthcare industry. Like if we had self-driving cars right now who could be taking people to and from their healthcare providers and not having to have other people involved in that, that could be really useful.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Especially with everything's going on right now. So we have another question. So when do you think we will have a level 5 autonomous for consumers to use?
Hopefully soon, but I suspect not as soon as people like to think. There are a lot of fairly optimistic predictions about, oh, we're going to have self-driving cars ready for you to buy by the end of 2020. And even before 2020 got derailed by a global pandemic, I don't think we were going to be quite there yet. I think the technology is going to advance a lot faster than the legal and regulatory aspects surrounding that technology. And I think this is something that there's going to have to be a lot of regulation for in the early stages as people are figuring out how to navigate this changing ecosystem. So I do think we're at least a few years away from level 5 being consumer ready, but I would love to be proven wrong about that.
Okay, awesome. I think that's it. Well, Vienna, we definitely appreciate your time. Autonomous systems and self-driving cars stuff is going to be here regardless of our personal kind of thoughts about it, or for everybody who's watching, even if we decided to transition into that field or not. But there's definitely benefits of definitely transitioning that field, because you actually can be the person to write particular code to save somebody's life. So we're I'm going to put up Vienna's speaker card and stuff now, so you guys can follow with her. Shoot her email follow-up questions. But Vienna, definitely appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Awesome. All right, Vienna, you have a great day.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to take we've got a 10-minute break here, and then we're going to switch over to X. X is another person who is at Google, and she's going to talk about transitioning the benefits of becoming an AI developer. And so we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back.